Back in the summer, and quite by chance, you and I were entranced by the smart Roadster. Our conclusion being that, while flawed, this brilliant little car deserved so much more than it got. These mini supercars were available for less than 3 years, and around that same time, the sports car world grew poorer with the death of MG Rover. For a period, however, this quirky little Roadster had a shot at becoming the saviour of MG. So today on Twin Cam, this is the story of Project Kimber. In the halcyon days of stable economies and adventurous car manufacturers, Daimler-Benz entered a joint venture with Swatch, the Swiss timepiece maker, to forge out something of a city car executive class. The result was, of course, the Smart City Coupe, and though its gestation wasn't all that rosy, praise was universal for its concept car style, as it was proclaimed to be the future of urban chic personal transport. After the Swiss withdrew, the newly formed Daimler Chrysler had both a radical new car and an all-new French factory in which to build it. But despite exceptional product awareness and a strong image, Smart was hemorrhaging money. In what will come as a shock to precisely nobody, designing a car and building a factory was expensive, and since the Smart had a naturally limited customer base, Daimler had to expand on the formula. Crafted out of the City Coupe's parts bin, the Smart Roadster debuted as a concept car at the 1999 Frankfurt Motor Show, and by the time you could buy one in 2003, mercifully little had changed. This cutesy and chunky looking sports car was immediately popular, gifting the platform and the factory the extra volume it so dearly needed. They're not quick, what with a 700cc 3-pot engine and a maximum of 82 brake horsepower, but they weigh less than 800 kilograms, and with the grumbly soundtrack preceding factory turbo whooshy noises, they are phenomenally endearing to drive. The Achilles heel is the automated gearbox, but regardless, one of these will make you smile as widely as the car does. In fact, the Roadster's most famous patron is a certain Gordon Murray. You know, the chap who used to design Formula 1 cars for a living. That Gordon Murray. Until 2018 at least, his daily driver was a 700cc Smart that looks like a frog. But back to the point, and they had a target of 10,000 sales per year. But in their 3 years on sale, Smart managed to flog 43,000 Roadsters. So you might be wondering, why did they kill it off? Well, it all comes back to the point I made before about expense. While the Roadster brought more volume, it didn't bring viability. Smarts were still expensive to build, and they weren't the most dependable of things. If we ignore the electrical issues that plagued both cars, the Roadsters tended to leak like sieves, and in the end, warranty costs led to the Roadster's retirement. In those 3 years between 2003 and 2006, Smart lost €4 billion. At the same time, the whole Daimler Chrysler thing was heading south, so they had to cut liabilities, and as a result, a very popular little car lay on the scrap heap. Before we get to the point, however, we need to go back 6 years to the turn of the millennium, when the Roadster had just been unveiled as a concept car and the Rover group was owned by BMW. At this point, Rover was still relatively large, with 3 major car production plants and their Gaydon test facilities. However, when the Germans became fed up, they didn't merely sell Rover. Instead, they stripped Rover apart. We all know that BMW kept 1/3 of the business for themselves, namely the Cowley plant, the aborted R30 project and the R50 Mini. The next most profitable third was sold to Ford, who received Gaydon, the Solihull plant and everything Land Rover, including the yet-to-be-launched L322 Range Rover. But finally, the rump of the business, just hours from overall closure, was subject to a buyout by the Phoenix Consortium, led by former executive John Towers, and became MG Rover. This is the Longbridge-based third of the old Rover group that went bust on the 8th of April 2005, and frankly, that day was inevitable. Regardless of the controversy that came later, MG Rover was the rump. While the Rover 75 was very good and almost brand new, the Rover 45 was a Honda Civic, which meant that MG Rover had to pay royalties for its use, and the Rover 25 had parts within it that dated back nearly 20 years. To add insult to injury, the MGF sat on mechanical components that now dated back 10 years, and with no money or development facilities, we start to understand why these 4 cars could only be facelifted over the next 5 years. But while staring down death, MG Rover stood up and did their best to build an image. They took the 3 rather sleepy Rovers and transformed them into 3 fabulously antisocial MGs, the ZR, ZS and ZT. From this point on, it seems 90% of the firm's attention was directed towards the Octagon. They went rallying with the ZR, racing with the ZS, and even got Lola on board to enter the 24 Hours of Le Mans. In 2004, they brought us a V8 powered and rear drive MG ZT and the MG SV supercar. Now these were clearly vanity projects, and the consensus is that they were a waste. But if Longbridge was to have any future, then MG had to be the centre of it. The reason being that MG Rover didn't own Rover. If we think back to our thirds, we'll remember that Ford bought Land Rover, and of course, traditionally, the Land Rover and the Range Rover were models of Rover, and as such, the Blue Oval bought the rights to the Rover marque and licensed it to MG Rover. Therefore, in the aftermath of April 2005, the questions all centred around the Longbridge plant and MG, leading us to competition between a few people who all wanted to build sports cars with that famous Octagon on their noses. If we look at this holistically, we've in some senses returned to the year 2000, because the attractive part of the Phoenix Consortium's plans was that they wanted to keep the company operating essentially as it had been before, while alternative bidders planned to lay off the majority of the Longbridge staff and turn niche, building only the MGF. This is why the workforce all ran around proclaiming to have been saved by John Towers. But fast forward 5 years, and the pessimism from others had rather been justified. PwC, MG Rover's administrators, were greeted with 1.4 billion quid's worth of debt, and the 4 members of Phoenix had nabbed £42 million out of MG Rover's assets, including quite a lot of the pension fund. The waters are muddy here, so we're not going to go any further into it, but the 4 were each banned from managing companies for a number of years, and the administrators looked towards the future. By July 2005, no real progress had been made, but 3 bidders had made themselves known. 2 of these were Chinese-based, namely Nanjing Automotive and the Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation, SAIC. The latter of these is the most interesting because Phoenix had courted SAIC into a joint venture back in 2004. The plan was for the Chinese to invest up to £1 billion into MG Rover in exchange for 70% of the company. However, this deal started hitting roadblocks as the Chinese government and its National Development and Reform Commission was wary of agreeing to a deal with a terminally sick company. On the other hand, the British government was all up for it, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown trying to keep MG Rover alive without resorting to intervention, because that would look far too socialist for New Labour. To try and grease the tracks, however, the British government was offering a loan which was still on the table by the time MG Rover collapsed. Therefore, it won't surprise you to hear that SAIC was the preferred bidder, and if we quickly fast forward nearly 20 years to today, and SAIC did indeed get their hands on the lease to the Longbridge site, MG Rover's intellectual property and the MG brand itself. However, back in 2005, the race was still on. SAIC were undoubtedly the favourites, but among the rather crowded field were the aforementioned Nanjing as well as Project Kimber. Here's where we finally come face to face with the main subject of the video, and if you've been keeping track of the dates, you might have realised that the Smart Roadster was still being produced in 2005, which means that their initial plan couldn't have included our little frog-faced friend. But superficially, Project Kimber bears some resemblance to one of the bids I mentioned from 2000, so I hope you can now see why all that context was necessary. What I'm absolutely sure you'll have realised is that Project Kimber was named after Cecil Kimber, the founder of the original MG car company, and the man behind it all was corporate troubleshooter David James. And no, this one's never played in golf for England. He was, however, responsible for saving the Millennium Dome from financial ruin and became Lord James in 2006. But back to the story, and it was reported that James's bid came to around £40 million. But after 3 months of purgatory, on the 22nd of July 2005, it was announced that Nanjing was the successful bidder, and they took control of MG Rover's assets. A pessimist would suggest that this was the end of Project Kimber, but in the short term, not all that much was happening when it came to restarting car production. By the beginning of 2006, swathes of Longbridge had been slated for demolition, by the end of which no manufacturer could have treated it as the major production plant that MG Rover once did. In this climate, on the 17th of February, the Times reported that David James had approached Nanjing with the view of buying the rights to the MG name. It sounds a little far-fetched today, but in 2006 this looked like a genuine possibility. It certainly wasn't likely, but it was possible. After all, what remained of Longbridge was essentially abandoned, complete with cars sat on production lines just as they were 10 months earlier. To any outsider, it would appear as though Nanjing weren't interested. Off the back of this, Project Kimber also approached Daimler Chrysler, offering £13 million for the intellectual property and tooling for the recently deceased Smart. This is when the ball really starts rolling, with David James appearing regularly in news articles as a potential saviour of MG, and as such he started building a small team of engineers, advisors and financial backers to allow Project Kimber to come to fruition. Key amongst these were Barry Wills, formerly of Reliant and DeLorean, and the aforementioned Mr. Murray. And if he's involved, you know it's going to be good. But as you and I established last year, the Roadster was a perfectly good car already, so the necessity of re-engineering comes from a facelift to the Roadster's plastic panels, as well as the powertrain. You see, the rights to the original M160 engine had been retained by Daimler, so Kimber had to find a new engine. And me being me, I'd have been hoping for some way of squeezing in the orphaned Rover K-Series. Yes, I'm a glutton for punishment, but imagine one of these little fellas with 160 brake horsepower and revving very happily to well over 7,000 RPM. However, sense prevailed, as well as packaging I'm sure, and they found Mitsubishi a willing partner, happy to provide their 3B21T, a 1-litre turbocharged 3-cylinder with dual camshafts and an output of 84 brake horsepower. Funnily enough, this engine would appear only months later in the second generation Smart 42, which sounds like too much of a coincidence to me, but it's what the Telegraph said. Regardless of the quality of my sources, what will make a lot of people quite happy is the replacement of the Roadster's original automated gearbox with a true 3-pedal Getrag produced manual. That sounds like perfection to me, even without a mayonnaise making K-Series. At this point, things were looking relatively good, but it seems that somewhere along the line, Nanjing rejected Kimber's approach to buy MG. This Chinese firm then merged with SAIC, bringing us up to date with the ownership of what was once MG Rover. But again, just as in July 2005, it would have been easy for them to simply throw in the towel. But instead, they set about reviving another, more unlikely classic British name, AC. There's another twin-cam connection in here, as earlier last year you and I studied the ill-fated AC Brooklands Ace from the 1990s, masterminded by a man named Brian Anglis. However, after this venture failed, Anglis sold the rights to another man named Alan Lubinsky, who still owns it today and still produces replica Cobras. But according to a press release on the 31st of August 2006, a deal was struck in order to allow Project Kimber to use the name. At long last, we now have a car to build, an engine to power it, a name to place on its nose, and an experienced team to develop it. What we don't have, however, is a factory to build it in. Longbridge, of course, was off the cards, as half of it was turning into housing estates and the other half was being readied for the resumption of car production under Nanjing. So two alternatives were bandied about. In February 2006, it was reported that this was to be a section of the historic Fort Dunlop, but I have to cast some doubt on this. At the time, Dunlop was still producing tyres on the site, while the main building had been taken over by Travelodge, meaning that whatever space Project Kimber had secured, it was small. However, within 5 months, this plan appears to have been scrapped, replaced by an unknown location in South Wales. A press release from the Welsh Government suggests that this was to be an all-new factory and that a £5 million grant was on offer to secure production of 8,000 cars in the first year. I can't help but feel that this was enormously optimistic, but it's clear that the project had some serious backing. Yet after this exact point, in July 2006, the trail turns dead. The Project Kimber website wasn't updated once following this guarantee that something really was going to happen, and barring a few murmurs in the years after, nothing was heard again. There are some striking similarities between Kimber and the revised TVR from a few years ago, also featuring some Gordon Murray magic and destined to be built in South Wales. But as with the AC Badge Smart, nobody's holding their breath. In the end, however, I don't think there was any real chance of Project Kimber succeeding, neither in putting the car into production nor making a success of it. Not only were the rights to both the marque and the car rather complicated, but as Daimler found out themselves, building cars can get enormously expensive. If one of the world's largest manufacturers manages to lose €4 billion in 3 years, then how a small group proposes to pick up the pieces, I do not know. And on that disappointing note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.